should be back. If you see me
Well,
back,
don't worry.
then I'll be back. Yeah.
Yeah, shoot me a message in alt space.
Let me go
Sure.
to go on air. So I should be on air now.
And I'm on air as well. Excellent. Hey everyone, welcome back to the second session of the workshops track of the AES Audio for Virtual and Augmented Reality Conference, AltSpace VR Extravaganza. Today and right now we have Brian Schmidt, who is going to present to us a really, I don't know, exciting, I guess, tutorial about limitations of human hearing and how source content and human expectations affect sound localization. I'm personally just very curious about how the Mona Lisa relates to this, and I'm very excited to hear more information about what exists and what factors exist beyond the big four. So let's give Brian a bit of an emoji storm, and we can get on with the session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sally. Everybody hear me okay? If you can't hear me, make a frowny emoji. Okay, that's a good sign. Please relax. Everybody sit down. Don't worry. Oh, wait, you can't sit down. Thank you. And I'm Brian Schmidt. I've been doing 3D sound for quite a while, since the early 80s. I had the great fortune to study at Northwestern when one of the earliest digital implementations of HRTF and 3D audio was done under Professor Gary Kendall and his colleague, graduate student at the time, Bill Martins. So I've just always sort of loved 3D audio. So I'm going to zip through some things pretty quickly in the beginning, just a little bit of review for everybody at something like AVAR. And also approach a little bit from a content creation standpoint, right? I'm a composer, sound designer, and so that's, I think, how we approach technology, and understanding some of these things can make us create better technology to create these experiences. So, how do we hear in 3D, and what are some of these rules of thumb we've been telling content creators for a number of years? Oops, my mic is garbled. Can I re-enter the space? I will re-enter the space. I'll be right back.
Thanks everybody for standing by here. Brian should be back in just a moment once he makes it through hyperspace and the holodeck and all the other layers of reality that we were all dealing with today. I'm going to go look for him, see if he got lost.
Sorry, I had to run here. Okay, can people hear me again? Okay, there we go. Take two. So, how do we hear in 3D space? I like to call it the big 3 plus 1, big 3 plus reverb. Obviously, we have an IID, intensity difference, sometimes called the ILD. This goes all the way back to Lord Rayleigh, near the end of the 19th century. Somebody is unmuted and there's a lot of, like, it almost sounds like a garbage can noise going on.
Whoops.
Yes.
Okay, good now. So his Sedgwick lecture in 1906 noted that when a pure tone of a low pitch is recognized as being on the right or the left, the only alternative intensity theory is to suppose that the judgment is found in the difference of the phases. He did this with tuning fork. So ID has been established, obviously, for quite some time as an important localization clue. The next one, of course, is ITD, interaural time difference. And actually, we're pretty good at ITD discrimination. Our ability to distinguish time difference between the two ears it's frequency dependent. It's around 0.01 milliseconds, or about 10 microseconds, which is about a half a sample at 48 kilohertz. So we're actually pretty good at that. Now, an interesting thing is that, like ID, which is very frequency dependent, ITD is also very frequency dependent. And in fact, the best performance of ITD is about 1 kilohertz. And it goes away completely above about 1300 hertz. So one of the people studying this noted that they were aware of no aspect of human hearing that shows a more dramatic dependence on frequency than ITD. Of course, ITD and IID still leave us with a cone of confusion. And for that reason, our ears evolved to be very funny shaped. So that's straightforward pin and transfer function. This is an example. This is the HRTF. I actually stole this off of Sony's recent presentation that Mark Choueiri gave, talking about the PlayStation 5. And you can see this particular graph shows the effect of directionality on the frequency response of the contralateral ear in this case. So the very, very dark green, blue blotches, those are very, very steep notches, approaching 40 dB notches at, you know, what's that, around 12 kilohertz, something like that. 8 kilohertz, there's some, 12 kilohertz and above, there's others. So it's very, very drastic changes in frequency response we have as a result of pin and transfer functions. And that, of course, is one of the things that helps with elevation and so on. It's very interesting to know that HRTFs don't really do a ton below about 3 kilohertz. And I think it's very fascinating how our hearing system evolved, that right below about 1500 hertz or so, IID and ITD are pretty strong cues. And then as you get in higher frequencies, HRTFs kick in, as well as IID. So ITD is great for lower, not so great for higher. IID and HRTF kicks in with a higher higher frequency. So we have the whole range kind of covered, which is very nice. And then, of course, we have our feeling of space and our notion of distance is greatly aided by reflection modeling. Again, this is why there are so many papers here on how do we accurately model rooms and how do we do diffraction and so on. The original Northwestern system I was talking about was called the spatial reverberator, and it in fact, for a shoebox room, did HRTF modeling of, I forgot how many reflections was done on that system. So those are kind of the big three plus one, IID, ITD, HRTF, plus we have a reverberant environment, and that gives us a lot of feeling of distance. Now, of course, there's a little bit more going on. Even with great HRTFs and so on, we still have what's known as the front-back reversal problem. And one way that we, as physical organisms, deal with that, of course, is we move our head around. We essentially can turn 2 ears into 4 ears or 6 ears or more by small head motion movements. You recall the time discrimination of our 2 ears was about 10 microseconds. If you translate that into head rotation, that means if you move your nose about 2 millimeters, that there is enough of a change in distance, enough of a change in intensity between the 2 ears that we recognize that. So it's a pretty small amount of head movement that we can actually detect. So going on, that seems like it covers about everything. And I promised I would skip through this slide quickly. I'll go to this one.
Another one that's basically could be done right now is audio. If anybody wanted to spend all the resources that we have today in terms of using the GPUs for it and all the floating point processing power, audio could be done. I mean, we could go ahead and have all the head modeling, all the the radiosity style sound transfer through very complex environments, and we certainly have the the sample rate and the and the bit depth for all of that. But it just doesn't really pay off in the current generation of things to devote that much effort to it. But given a couple more turns of the processor generations, audio will just be done.
So that was John Carmack in 2004. John Carmack's actually a brilliant graphics researcher. He was the CTO of Oculus up until November 2019. Back in 2004 at GDC, he basically said, hey, once we can model all this stuff, audio's just done. A couple more turns of processor, that's enough CPU to do all this. It's kind of interesting that again, we've gone through about 3 cycles of processor. And I think one of the interesting things is that if you talk to audio content people, audio isn't really very close to being done. There's a great Japanese saying, "Saramoki kara ochiru," which means even a skilled monkey sometimes falls from a tree. Basically meaning that even the biggest expert will sometimes be wrong. And so, in my opinion, John Carmack, as brilliant as he is, was simply not right. That audio, for all we have to do is model these things, and we have enough math, enough DSP, and everything's done. So I'm going to do a little game now that I like to do. I normally do this live. Doesn't really make any sense to do it live in VR. But so I'm going to do a version of it that was taped at GDC about 5 years ago. So let's play this little game here.
But I need a volunteer. Yes, come on up. So it's a simple game. The game is a snap your finger game. I'm going to snap my finger. You're going to sit with your eyes closed, honor system, and point to exactly where you believe the sound is coming from. And make a big gesture so the whole back of the room can see it. Everybody see that? Make that last location again. Put your arm out longer. Open your eyes. Thank you very much. Let's give a big hand. Phew.
So I'm generally confident enough that I will do that live in front of a room of 200 people. I've done that demo probably 50 or 60 times. And I think I like it because it really shows that we just aren't very good in the actual universe, you know, at localizing sounds in 3D space with no other information at all. And so I think it's interesting to take that approach, because I've been doing 3D audio for a number of years for companies from Q Sound to we put HRTF in the original Xbox. And there's always this notion that we can precisely place sounds in 3D space using digital techniques. And I think we have to keep in mind that it's very difficult for us, even in the actual universe, not a simulation, but the real world, to do this stuff. So it's something that can be very, very tricky. So that's something I've just been very fascinated with, and that's a little bit of what this talk about is how are some of the ways we're not that good, and what other factors might impact that. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the visual system. I'm going to skip real quick closely here. So as most of us know, the way the visual system works is there's the outside world out there, light hits an object, reflects off of it into our eye, where it's focused on the back of our retina, and there's literally a picture of the world mirrored on the back of our eyeballs. At the back of their eyeballs are a bunch of photoreceptors that are connected directly to neurons. In the densest places, it's about 1-to-1 sensor to neuron. So that actually gives us a nice, accurate mapping of the visual world to a neural representation of our world. So for this next bit, if you haven't zoomed in, I'd like you to zoom in on the screen a little bit. If you're in 2D mode, you can zoom by holding down the right mouse button and scrolling your wheel. And I want you to look at the heart on the screen and keep looking at it. And don't look away until I tell you to look at it. Okay? Keep looking at it, keep looking at it, keep looking at it. Now I want you to, while you're still looking at it, consider which of those Mona Lisas looks better. Okay, now you can look away from the heart. So this is from Nova TV series called Decoding Da Vinci. And one of the things I think it does is it really lets us, know that our visual system really isn't that great. And that's because it's really not designed to be. So this is a visual representation of the different kinds of photoreceptors we have in our eyes. The blue ones in the center are called cones. They're high resolution, they can see color. And they're very, very densely packed right at that focal point of our eyeball. So when you're staring at something, that part of the image is right in that blue circle there. Now, and you'd think we would, because this is kind of what we should see. But one thing that we've evolved to do is our brain does an amazingly great job at hiding our poor visual acuity at the periphery. It also, of course, hides our blind spot. We all have a blind spot in each eye where literally there are no photoreceptors, but it's not like we go around conscious of that. Another example of this, by the way, you can see if you're reading, stare at a word in the center of a page and simply try to read one of the words, 3 or 4 words to the left. You just can't do it. but it doesn't feel like we have this massive reduction in resolution as we go outside of our visual gaze. And some graphic systems take advantage of this through what's called foveated rendering, where they have high resolution graphics where you're watching, where you're looking, and to save CPU power, lower resolution graphics at your periphery. So keep that in mind for the next few slides here, and actually for the whole rest of the deck. So our auditory system, of course, is very different. This is the cochlea, sort of a artist rendition of it. What the cochlea does, of course, is it essentially uses standing waves to create a mechanical FFT of the sound coming in. So it does do frequency discrimination. We can tell what frequencies sounds there are, and we can tell the amplitude of those frequencies. We can tell how they change over time, and we can compare our inputs from each of our two ears. But that's really it, right? The nerve cells along the cochlea, so all they can do is say, oh, there's a sound at this frequency, and it's at about this amplitude. So we don't have that literal physical mapping of the sonic world to 3D space like we do in the visual world. And as a result, and again, this has been characterized reasonably well over the years, we just don't hear that well in 3D space. This shows our approximate accuracy directly in front of us, which is where our best acuity for hearing is. Our accuracy is about plus or minus 3 degrees, 3.5 degrees, something like that. And if you wanted to compare that to direct to vision, if you have 20/20 vision, you can see about 1 millimeter of acuity at 6 meters. If you do the math, do the trig, our auditory system gives us at 6 meters an accuracy of about 70 centimeters. So even at our very, very best auditory localization spot, our audio is maybe, it's like 2 to 3 orders of magnitude worse than our visuals. And I think that trips us up sometimes as we're looking for expectations of crystal clear pinpoint localization when that's just not how our system was designed. And of course, above, it's even worse. And this diagram here is really why I feel comfortable enough to give that test, to snap my fingers in front of them and assume that they will always point behind them. I feel so confident that I do that quite regularly. And in the words of Ivan Teshev, a Microsoft 3D audio researcher, audio is really kind of 2.5D-ish. We don't really have true 3D hearing. We're just not that good. So it's almost as if we went through the auditory world looking more like this. Right, a moving shape at the edge of our vision is going to draw our eye. Our peripheral vision isn't designed to be high resolution. It's designed to essentially detect motion. Once we detect motion, we now turn our gaze. Oh, I can turn my gaze. See? To whatever we saw out of the corner of our eye and then run away from it. And sound, it's kind of the same thing, except that instead of the peripheral, are the motion sense being done by detecting a visual change in image, our auditory motion detector works by detecting vibrations created by moving objects, hitting other objects, creating vibrations in the air that make it to our ears. And it's actually pretty cool. If you think about what our senses do to allow us to detect our environment, sound is the only sense that we have that is really both low latency and works at 360 degrees, right? Smell works at 360 degrees, but smell is very long latency, right? If I had to smell the bear before I knew the bear was there, then I'm going to be the bear's lunch. Taste is obviously also, it's very low latency, but you have to be in close proximity. And if I had to taste the bear before I knew the bear was there, I'd also be a bear's lunch. Touch is low latency, but it also has extremely limited range. If I have to touch the bear before I know it's there, that's a problem. Sight obviously is low, very, very low latency, but if it's something's behind me, it's a useless sense. So sound is really the only motion detector we have that works works like that. And that's one of the reasons I think of sound as peripheral vision more than gaze vision. And I think we can make a lot of content creators by sort of realizing that. I actually published a iOS game, this was back in 2012, that was designed to be kind of whack-a-mole except for sound. A purely 3D audio game where you had to do pinpoint accuracy, and it was so maddeningly difficult, I had to drastically change the rules to account for the fact that our hearing just is not precise enough for what I thought I wanted the game mechanic to be, which was you hear something and you tap the screen at the corresponding 3D location and you get it. Unfortunately, this game's not available anymore. It was a 32-bit iOS game, and I never got around to updating it for 64-bit. But it was a big lesson learner for me about the accuracy of synthetic 3D sound. So what about distance? Well, it turns out that we're not really that great at distance either. Just like azimuth, in this particular case, the dotted lines represent people's responses to how far away they thought sound was compared to the straight line, which is what it really was. And again, this is not a simulation. This isn't HRTF or room modeling. This is real human beings in real environments. So we tend to compress the distance of sound. And it actually turns out that this work has been characterized for both sighted and non-sighted in anechoic and non-anechoic environments and across different types of sound, speech, music, noise. And again, they all kind of show a very similar thing, that we're just not that great at distance. Maybe we're okay when it's not too far away, but beyond a certain point, where we think the sound is coming from is just not well correlated to where it actually is coming from. So, you know, it's not that simple. 3D audio is a very complicated thing. And part of it is different sounds behave in different ways as well. This is a spectrogram. This is a screenshot from Isotope RX, one of the most useful audio tools ever invented. The orange the blue is the waveform in the time domain. The orange is the waveform in the frequency domain, 0 hertz being at the bottom, Nyquist being up at the top, and the intensity of the yellow being frequency content. So there really is, in this helicopter sound, it's a broad band sound, lots of frequencies all over the place. And I think it's no coincidence that 3D audio demos, a lot of them have helicopters or very broad-bound sounds all over the place. One of the most effective sounds, and the spatial reverberator I think ever did at Northwestern, was a buzzsaw sound that even through speakers just totally sounds like it's just whipping right around the back of your head. Because it's a nice, and if you think about it, that makes sense. If the HRTF filters have significant notches up above, 8 or 10 kilohertz, there better be some signal there. There better be some signal there for the filters to be able to affect. So by contrast, something like a bird is a little bit tougher. Right, there's not a lot of frequency content. There's very little below, a couple kilohertz, which means that ITD is going to be kind of useless. Sorry, ID is going to be kind of useless. So sounds like these can be more difficult to localize just because there's not enough frequency meat for the sound to grab onto. And this has been studied a little bit more robustly by looking at how well do people, not used to having to unplug my physical telephone while giving a presentation. How well do people listen to how do they localize sounds that have been deliberately low-pass filtered. And I'll jump to the next slide, which breaks this out. This is the same view by azimuth. And you can see that low-pass filtered sounds, and some of them are, this is a combination of sounds low-pass filtered at 1.5 kilohertz or 3 kilohertz. For the most part, azimuth estimation is pretty decent, although, again, I would go back to the errors, even in azimuth, are pretty great, right? The source azimuth in one case was about 60 degrees, and somebody thought it was at 10 degrees. So even in this very clean looking graph, our azimuth acuity is not perfect. So compare it, however, though, to elevation. Basically, without frequency components above 3 kilohertz, there is no way to determine elevation. None of the sounds that had their that were low pass filtered were perceived to be from elevated sources, even though the speaker from which they were playing was elevated above them. And so the way this paper put it is that the elevation components have a gain that is indistinguishable from zero. There's no way to tell these sounds apart. Likewise, the environment in which the sounds are played can have a big impact. The top row of graphs in this this picture are the azimuth estimates by a listener in increasingly amounts of noise, or decreasingly from left to right. So at the far right, you hear a very good signal-to-noise ratio estimation. It looks pretty much along the line. But as you start adding noise into the entire system, it becomes more difficult to localize even azimuth. And again, when we're talking about creating virtual reality experiences or mixed reality experiences, we're not talking about playing isolated noise bursts in an anechoic chamber. We're talking about, we're trying to simulate real-world environments where you've got trees or birds or an office environment or an operating room or something like that. So I think it's important to understand how the ability for us to localize the sound is diminished simply by being in a more noisy environment. And difficult to localize, and another sound with similar frequency content that is taken from nature. And in the Oculus documentation it says, for synthetic or unfamiliar sound sources we have no frame of reference and must rely on other cues to predict if a sound, for example, is approaching or receding. So that's an important characteristic as well. And then, of course, there's the ventriloquism effect. And this has been reasonably well studied. And I encourage people who are interested in it to, there are a bunch of papers by Witten and Knudsen who've done a good overview of the ventriloquism effect. Anytime we go to a movie theater, or when we used to go to movie theaters, we experienced it tremendously because most typically dialogue in a motion picture comes through the center speaker only. But yet when we're in the movie theater, we don't perceive it as coming from the center of the speaker. We perceive it as coming from the character's mouth. And in particular, it can be quite dramatic. In this, sometimes you can have subjects where you literally make the sound come out of a speaker behind them, but if there's a person's mouth moving in front of them, they will fuse the sound to the video. And it appears that the sense with a higher acuity seems to have more dominant impact on the location of the sound. They actually did some tests where they reversed it, where they had very, very, very low resolution visual images, and they as high, more highly precise audio images. And in that case, the visual would actually fuse to the sound. So it is kind of interesting how that works. And this has been studied even further. This particular graph and the next picture are from a paper by Akiko Callahan and Hiroshi Ando, which is called an fMRI study of the ventriloquism effect. And this basically shows that it's not just people reporting that there appears, what people are reporting appears to be reflected in their neurological response to auditory stimulus in the presence or absence of visual stimulus. Again, so the ventriloquism effect appears to be down to the neurological level. Some other factors that can help things out are things like training. That was discussed earlier today, or perhaps it was at the previous, one of the earlier talks. And that you can actually learn how to, or you can reduce front-back reversals with short training periods. And in fact, that in this particular study, there were 2 30-minute training sessions that significantly reduced front-back reversals. And that, interesting, is that the effect appeared to persist for up to 4 months. So it's almost like, like somebody put different pinna on your ears and you learned them, then you went back to your own ears and 4 months later picked up these other ears and put them back on, and you were still able to perceive things. Now this particular study, it wasn't shown whether or not they literally perceived front back better, or if they simply had learned the difference of the sound of front and the sound back. And I learned this in my Ear Monsters game, because actually not surprisingly, it became relatively popular in the visually impaired community. And people will report back to me that they got to be quite good at the game through practice, but it wasn't necessarily that they perceived a sound from behind them so much as they learned to understand what the sound of behind them was supposed to be. So again, I think it could be a fascinating follow-up study for somebody to look at doing, to see how persistent these effects are all the way down at the neurological level. Are people perceiving the sounds after these training sessions, or have they simply intellectually learned what the sound differences between up and down is? So that hasn't been super well characterized. Moving sounds is a fascinating thing. It turns out that moving both helps us and hinders us. It is more difficult to pinpoint a moving sound than a stationary sound. However, we appear to have, according to a paper from auditory neuroscience by Hall and Moore, that sounds that are moving towards us appear to elicit a greater neurological response than sounds that are not moving towards us. And their theory there was a sound moving towards you has greater biological salience, right? If the cheetah's running towards me, well, if the cheetah's running towards me, I'm kind of out of luck. If a creature slower than a cheetah is running towards me, I'm in big trouble. If the antelope is running away from me, I don't really have to pay so much attention to that. So, and just the act of a sound being in motion changes the underlying neural response you have to sounds. Again, it's sort of like peripheral vision, right? A sound in motion is going to be different than a sound that pops in and out. Oh, sorry, than a visual image that pops in and out. Another one, of course, is preconceptions. This is something I have not seen formal studies on, but I think it's a great potential topic for somebody's thesis. Both Google and Microsoft separately reported, for example, they were having trouble making a bird song localize below the horizon. Even through the same HRTF filters and room modelers that would take a noise pulse and have a nice, vivid below the horizon image. So preconceptions obviously plays a big role. I want to revisit distance real quickly. So I'm going to play a quick video, which I like to use to demonstrate. And I want you to pay attention to how the creators of this video emulated distance.
Hello there, this is your old pal Grover. And today I'm going to talk to you about near and far. In fact, I, little furry Grover, am going to show you near and far. Okay, here goes. First, this is near. Right here, near. This is far. This is near. You see?
So I like this video because the Children's Television Workshop people did a pretty good job, I think. You know, Grover's voice is low pass filtered. It becomes more reverberant. You hear the footsteps and so on. So it's very, very clear. But one thing that is also very, very salient that is easy to forget in terms of our distance perception is the fact that when Grover was far away, he was shouting. And the timbre of his voice, the frequency content, the inflection was very, very different than when he was up close, or certainly than he would be if he were up whispering in your ear. So source familiarity can have an incredible impact, and this has actually been pretty robustly studied. They looked at normal speech, time-reversed speech, which did not show this same effect of being able to determine purely by the source content how sound. Forget, no HRTF, no panning, no modeling, no reverb, nothing. Just by the source content, how far away are they? Bengali speech did show this effect. That is a language that's phonetically similar to English. But the time-reverse speech did not show that effect. So you couldn't tell whether time-reverse speech was near or far based solely on the source material itself. So it's something more than just harmonic content. There's something else going on there. And it's going to be very, very difficult if you want to create an immersive experience. And if there's a human character, or even as we'll see in the next slide, an animal that is moving closer or farther from you, if their dialogue, if the way that their tone of inflection doesn't reflect their change in distance, it's not going to seem real. It's not going to feel present. Yes, you'll be able to localize with the HRTF, and the room will be modeled correctly and so on, but it just won't sound right. Something will be wrong. And this kind of thing has made it into current day interactive entertainment. The PlayStation 4 Spider-Man game, which came out in 2018, they literally recorded twice virtually all of Peter Parker's lines. That's Spider-Man. And one of them is for when Peter Parker is not exerting himself, and another is. So if Peter Parker is hanging out, he'll deliver a line with a pretty normal voice. But if he's swinging on his web or he's fighting somebody, he will speak with a different voice. The same line, he'll say it with a different voice if he's swinging on the web than if he's swinging on the web. And that adds a level of interactivity and realism and sort of bringing you into the environment that obviously has nothing to do with room modeling or HRTF or any of the things that John Carmack was talking about. And again, it turns out, this has been studied to a certain extent for non-human animal sounds, and there is a similar effect that goes on. Also, as I mentioned before, that there's even more going on. that urgent sounds tend to localize as closer. An urgent sound might be a sound that implies semantic danger, a baby crying, somebody calling for distress. You'll perceive those as being closer. And one very interesting study, simply when a listener was in an afraid state, sound were perceived as being closer and visuals were not when the listener was in the same state. And the way they did this is they had them write very scary stories and then had them judge the distance of sounds. Right? It's one of those experiments where they pretend the experience is about something else. And it was very robust that if they had just written and read back a very scary story, they routinely judge sounds to be closer than if they were not in that afraid state. So, and just about out of time, so I'll wrap this up. And it goes a little bit even beyond that. And I think I forgot who was mentioning it this morning, but there is more to VR, AR simulations than simply trying to say how accurately can we localize things. In this particular graph on the left, if you look at it, they lumped, after putting the participants through some VR experiences, they categorized them as, good localizers or not so good localizers. But then they had them rate their VR experiences not on how accurately can we localize these sounds, but how natural were things. How real did it sound? And an interesting little byproduct was that they found that the people who they determined to be worse at localizing actually reported more natural experiences. Now, they're not sure if that was because the good localizers were just intently focused on localization and maybe the poor ones weren't. But it is, I think it was Poppy that was mentioning cognitive load, right? How much effort does it take us neurologically to understand our world? And if we can make things more coherent, then we can create more immersive, more vivid experiences, or more utilitarian with less cognitive load on people. And so just as food for thought, if we could just perfect HRTFs and reflections, doesn't address a lot of the issues that we have in 3D audio, certainly for people who are creating content. And that emulating physics really isn't enough. That we need to be looking at how could create tools and technologies and codify things like human expectations or source material familiarity and context and state of mind of user. How can we make these things into people's toolboxes? And there's some rules of thumb that we've given people along the way here. So I want to just go over those real quickly. Right, this is what we've been telling sound designers, for a number of years in VR. Use broadband sounds, play on preconceptions, use motion, placement, and focus. These seem good. There seems to be some good science data to back up those recommendations. Use natural rather than synthetic sounds. Don't try to mislead people. Again, I had a mechanic in Air Monsters where I was going to put a visual image and then have the sound somewhere else, and that was it turned out that was a really bad idea. It's a heavy cognitive load to resolve that dissonance. And if you're trying to make an entertainment experience, it can make something that was kind of fun into not fun really quickly. So yeah, our rules of thumb look like they're pretty good. So that's good. So wrapping it up before I have one last final slide, right. Human hearing is imprecise, and I think that's something we need to keep in mind, especially when we're educating content creators about expectations of 3D audio. They can be very, very powerful. It adds a lot to the experience, but be careful you're not trying to do microsurgery thinking you have a scalpel when you kind of have a machete. We've got lots of techniques that seem like the physics, and I'm always inspired by all the awesome stuff I see at conferences like AVAR, that we continue to push the boundaries of that, and it's super important. But a lot of localization can't really be categorized or solved with more DSP. Physical HRTF modeling is one piece of that. And again, I don't mean to downplay its importance, but it's necessary, but not necessarily fully sufficient. And I think there's no shortage of potential master's or PhD topics here. The areas where neuroscience meets spatial audio, meets VR and visual media experience, I think is ripe, and there's lots of great work out there. So I did want to close with one last thing, which maybe why did I even bring Mona Lisa into this? So in 2000, Margaret Livingston at Harvard did a study of the Mona Lisa. And I'm just going to read a bit from her paper and then wrap up. So she said, the elusive quality of the Mona Lisa smile can be explained by the fact that her smile is almost entirely in low spatial frequencies, so is best seen by your peripheral vision. The three images you see here show her face filtered to show selectively the lowest, the middle, and the highest spatial frequencies. So when you look at her eyes or in the background, you see a smile like the one on the left or in the middle, and you think she's smiling. But when you look directly at her mouth, it looks more like the panel on the right, and her smile seems to vanish. The fact that the degree of her smile varies so much with gaze angle makes her expression dynamic, and the fact that her smile vanishes when you look directly at it makes it seem elusive. So I think this is obviously, well, you know, Da Vinci was a genius and all that, but shows the importance of how in the hands of the right person you can turn the human perceptual system to your advantage. And you don't want to write off a peripheral sense as being unimportant or too imprecise to be of value and to be use. And when you have a great understanding, a really good understanding of the human perceptual systems and their limitations, and work within them and take advantage of them, that's when you can really create great art and great immersive experiences. So thank you for showing up virtually. All of a sudden it looks like we're in an aquarium because all these bubbles are floating. So is there a question protocol I'm supposed to follow?
I'll take care of that, if hopefully everyone can hear me. So there should be a button for raising your hand that will appear in everyone's bottom right corner, and if you click that, I can get this queue lined up where I can call on you guys. Len, go ahead.
I enjoyed the talk a lot. What you quoted of Tashev, that we really only have 2.5D of elevation. Practically, does that mean we only hear with any kind of reasonable resolution up to about 40 or 45 degrees? Is that correct?
Yeah, if I wish he were here because he could probably talk about that more specifically. I don't think when he said he was 2.5 degrees, he was specifically talking about a literal elevation cap. I think it's more that we are so imprecise, especially at elevation and declination, that to call it full 3D is a little bit misleading. So yeah, it's not like you can't put a sound above 90 degrees. It's just that when you do it, it's somewhere up there, but you just can't really tell where, other than that an impression of being above you.
Thank you.
Oop, having a little bit of technical difficulty. Okay, there we go. Aaron, go ahead and ask your question if you'd like.
Sure. Can you hear me, Brian?
Oh yeah, hi Aaron.
Hey, so this is a really important talk, I think, so I'm glad you gave it. One interesting
just lost Aaron. Did anybody else?
Yeah,
see
yeah,
Aaron?
All right. So the UI is telling me all kinds of things. Anyways, important thing that I feel is really important to talk about is the time dependency of spatial perception. In other words, in VR and virtual experiences, people sort of adapt in what they hear as you get used to where something is virtually. Have you come across any like studies that show over time, like for example, spatialization and localization ability improving, even though in the beginning naturally it wasn't good? Or can you speak to that issue?
There have been some, and I'd have to look up to the papers on it. Yeah, there is definitely a notion of you can learn somebody else's ears, for example. And that's kind of analogous to, have you ever seen these things where if you put a prism, if somebody wears a prism for long enough, you put a prism
Yeah,
in front of
exactly.
your eyes and the world is upside down. But if you put them on long enough, nope, I'm good for last question. Then I'll just try to hang out in the hall.
Yeah, Brian, I actually, because we're going to, it's 3 o'clock now or 2 minutes of, so I think that's going to be our last question. I'm sorry, I'm going to Bigfoot it here. I wish we could hang out more, and I'm hoping that you, Brian Schmidt, will hang out more with us in the AVAR lobby. If not today, then tomorrow or for the rest of the conference. I myself have a bunch of questions. I love this talk. It's the second iteration I've heard of it, and I want to thank everybody, and maybe another round of applause for the amazing Brian Schmidt. Awesome talk, Brian. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had fun doing this one because it goes over a lot of the things that we've sort of talked about informally. And it's like, oh, there's some research there.
Yeah, really good stuff.
Right.
I need to reset the slides for our next presentation, which is Edgar Choueiri talking about personal zone. And thank you so much.
I will go hang out in the AVAR lobby, but I do want to come back and see Edgar's talk.
Well, then just stay here then, everybody, because we're, I believe the talk, Morgan, am I right that it's 3 o'clock is Edgar's talk, right? Do I have that right, or am I? Yeah, so let's reset the space. Everybody, I'm hoping you can stick around. Dr. Edgar Choueiri from Princeton University. I believe he's here already. I thought I saw him. And we'll be getting underway in just a few minutes.
Did you update the slides already, Lawrence?
I did.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm gonna go reset the other room.
Great,
Hello,
thank you,
Lawrence, can you hear
Morgan.
me?
Yes, Edgar. Hi, where are you? Come on up
I'm
on
seeing,
stage.
I was perfectly fine. I just went to the dark now. So, okay,
What?
I know what's happening. I
Okay.
teleport myself behind the screen.
Oh yeah, you're lurking.
Okay.
Don't go back behind the screen. That's where we keep the bodies, and we don't want anybody to see that.
All right.
Yeah, so we'll take a minute to get set up here, and I loaded your deck in. I need to reset the browsers and the space, so I'm going to do that now. Here we go. We're resetting space. Actually, here we go.
Ah. Okay.
Yay. I'm seeing your first slide up there on the big screen.
Wait. Trying to get so to go to my Space Labs.
Hi, Brian.
And click on slides.
Hey, who said hi?
Oh, it was me.
Hey,
Great.
Edgar,
Brian.
Edgar,
Yes.
since
Hi.
I'm standing here talking to
Do you remember
there's
me?
Sal Kellaway
It's been a
is
while.
Our workshops chair, and she had to go. To
Probably
a
not.
doctor's
You
appointment,
probably
so
meet a
I'm
lot
gonna
of people.
introduce you.
I met you at
But I
GDC
didn't know
once
I
at the
was gonna
round
have to do
table.
this, so I don't have your
Oh,
bio in-
yeah, it was fun seeing.
No,
people
I
with
can introduce
avatars.
myself.
Okay, well,
I'll
I'm
be
just gonna
happy.
give
Looks
you
like
a
it's
very
starting.
informal
I'll
presentation
talk to
then.
you later, I
And
guess.
Sounds
then
good.
maybe
All right.
if you
See
would
ya.
just tell us, tell the folks who you are and all that,
Great.
because I just don't have, I didn't prepare, so.
Hey, Megan.
So,
Should I go ahead? Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, are you all set to go, and you got your slides and everything? You're all good to go?
Yes. I'm going to need just 1 second. Can I hold the laser in the other hand? That's the question.
That's
Or
a
it's
good
only.
question. I think you can, but I don't know how. I'm not
Let
sure.
me see. I dropped it on the floor.
See if you can use your left hand to pick up the laser.
I dropped it on the floor. It's now.
Yeah.
It's now all the way where the screen is.
No, it's rolling. It'll respawn. It'll respawn back in the
Okay.
podium in about
All right. Let me see how it goes here. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, looks like the slides are advancing, so that's great.
Almost passing.
Okay.
Here we go. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's looking good.
And now how to go? Trying to go back. Okay. So looks like it's working.
Oh, thanks.
Fantastic. Good. So you got your.
We also met at the GDC a while ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's you'll notice that the laser pointer
probably
has
not
respawned in the
the-
podium again.
Yeah, but I don't.
The
I don't think I can.
24th
I can do both at the same time.
Are you going to
It's
be?
just weird with
It,
it's
it,
just
the
weird
space
with
not,
avatars.
it may not allow it.
Are
I'm-
just looking
Okay,
at
that's
this
fine.
person.
All right.
So
Yeah, and I don't know. I've seen
unless
That's
you
fine.
want- unless
other
you want me to
Avatar
advance your slides.
creators.
No, actually, there are too many
You're
slides to
able to
advance. I'll do
kinda get
myself.
your
Thanks,
personality
Lawrence.
through a little bit more
Okay, Edgar.
effectively.
So are you ready to roll? Shall we?
Yes, I am. Yes, I
Oh
am.
yeah. Oh, before we do, there's a couple of
Are
things.
you going to post
thank you.
those slides anywhere, or
do you see your
not so much?
I
do you
think
see
that
your
AES will
host
post
tools
them.
menu? Oh shoot! I
Cool.
picked up the mic.
Uh,
Host tools menu on the right. To the right, it says host tools.
What are
Uh,
what are you
mm,
focused on these
yes,
days?
I do.
And click on that. and there's two
Actually,
icons
this
you want to
afternoon I'm
highlight. One is the little
mixing some
radio tower for go
heavy
on
metal
air.
pirate
That's
music
important so that
for a
you,
game
you
I'm
appear in all of the
I'm
color
doing.
rooms.
I'm teaching. I
The
teach system
radio.
It's a
Yeah,
little
yeah, the one that
icon
looks.
for Magic Leap.
Yeah,
says
it looks
go
like a
on
Kind of
air.
loudspeaker.
different things.
Yes.
Well, no, that's
Kinda multi-
amplify my
floating
voice.
Oh yeah, no, I
below
see that.
you
It's the
for some
It's the
reason.
fourth one. I just turned it on.
We want both
So
of
you
those
cut
on.
out
We
when
want
you were talking
amplify
about
my
Okay.
voice on
something about
and
music
go
for a
on
game.
air.
They're both
Yeah,
on.
so I'm working on it.
Yes.
And we have some DLC coming out in September.
All
so I'm
right.
The
working on
thing
that.
now. Oops.
Cool.
just one
GameSoundCon
second.
is keeping me busy too right now.
1 second, please.
Cool.
Okay.
Cool.
The
Nice
Sounds good.
running into you, so to speak.
All right. Okay. That's fine. It's all fine now. I'm all set.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yep.
All right, folks. I think Dr. Choueiri is ready to get started. So, is everybody seeing Dr. Choueiri's slide up on the screen here? Can I get some emojis here to see? Looks like. Awesome. It's really fun looking at all those emojis going up, isn't it, Edgar? Look at that. I just think it's cool. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get rolling here, unless any of our tech moderators tell me that we need to wait for any other reason. I'm going to give it the briefest of introductions to Dr. Edgar Choueiri from Princeton University. I've known Edgar for many years now. He's visited DigiPen several times. He gave a fantastic presentation at AVAR2018 on his crosstalk cancellation Bacch technology, but I won't go into that. Edgar is a fantastic scientist. He's also actually a bona fide rocket scientist. That's his day job, but I'll let him tell you about that. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Edgar Choueiri.
Thank you, Lawrence. Wonderful to be here. Thanks for the audience. My name is Edgar, and I work on spatial audio, as you see, and I also work on space propulsion. So I have two labs, one next to each other. This talk is co-written with one of my graduate students. His name is Yui Chao, and I think he's somewhere around the room, I hope. So this talk is meant to be an overview of a technology that's been in the making for some time, but only recently peeking its head quickly, I hope, that of personal sound zones. I will define what I mean by that, but quickly, it's the idea of delivering audio separately to different people in space, either creating silence and audio or delivering different audio programs to different people. You can imagine all the possible applications. I will mention a couple, of course. However, I should warn you, this talk is meant to be an overview of the formalism behind it. It turns out this technology, in order for it to bloom, requires a good formalism. As you'll see soon, it's going to be an optimization problem. So how to formulate this optimization problem is now the main question among many people working on this problem. So this talk might sound academic to some of you, but trust me, it is important for us to agree on a formalism as general and as encompassing and as powerful as possible, so we can solve this, as you will see, very complex problem. So I will not be going into details of a lot of details about implementation, where you put the speakers, where you put the listeners, and what you do with the microphones and so on. This is going to be more about an overview of the optimization formalism that people have tried to formulate as a framework to develop these technologies. And I will give some examples, or I'll refer to some practical issues, but it's mostly about the generalized formalism. Okay, so the talk is organization is in 4 chapters, so to speak. First, I want to tell you why, what is personal sound zone, what are the goals, and you will see it's pretty intuitive and exciting, because if you can make this work, the applications and possibilities are endless. And then I want to talk about 3 different methods for realizing personal sound zones. The first one dates back to 2002, and then the others have come relatively recently. The first one is called the Acoustic Contrast Control, ACC, and the second one is called the pressure matching method, and the fourth one is the one I've been working in my lab for the past 3 years now, called the modeler method. And we will see what the advantages of each and how successively each of this method is more general and becomes more powerful and more useful for applications. But already, even with the earliest one, some promising achievements have been reached, along with some interesting challenges that were revealed. So first, let me define what I mean by personal sound zone. So you can see right here, I don't have a laser pointer, so I'm going to tell you where geographically things are on the screen. So on the left side is a green bubble, and inside of it is someone watching a something on Netflix or something on their laptop or a desktop rather, and somebody in the center is holding a mobile phone inside his own bubble, and then there are people looking like they're going through a telecon or attending a conference together, again in their own bubble. Around the room, you see some speakers. So on the right, the problem is very clear: how to deliver different audio to different people so they can interact with their environment without having to worry about sound interference, sound from other zones interfering with them. So this is where the word personal and the word zone comes from. So in this case, there are only 3 zones and there are 4 speakers. Quickly, you learn in this business that 4 speakers are not enough. You need many more than that. But just this is a caricature of what the problem is like. Now, if we look closer from a formal point of view, we're talking about creating zones. These are, again, the same people inside their own bubbles. The bubbles don't have to be spherical or circles like this. They can be any shape in principle. This is only for illustration. And the idea is to surround them, not only necessarily surround them, but put with them a bunch of speakers, an array of speakers of different sizes potentially, that somehow create desired audio zones in some spots. Now, some of the desired audio zones could be silence. You could, for example, create silence in this room so somebody wants to relax or walk into that spot and will be isolated from the other sounds. But each, already you see some of the elements of the formalism. We need to talk about speakers. When we talk about we're going to be restricted. We want to be talking in the frequency domain. So I'll be talking about, because that's how formalisms are, powerful formalisms are easily developed in the frequency domain. So I'll be talking about complex gains for these speakers. So that you'll have an amplitude and phase in the complex domain that describes the signal that is fed to these speakers. And the whole goal is to feed the right signals and send the right programs to the space so that things cancel out and build up in such a way that you end up with these zones, each getting its own audio program rather. Okay. All right. So let's make things a little bit simpler. Let's just talk about 2 zones. Everything I'm going to say, even about 2 zones, can be generalized to multiple zones. So no need to complicate our lives with many, many zones. 2 zones, as you'll see, is a tough enough problem. But the formalism itself that you write for 2 zones can be easily extended for multiple zones. So we have a zone here that's bright color and one that's dark color, A and B. And we have loudspeakers. And the loudspeakers have complex gains. I don't know, this equation is too difficult to see from the back. Maybe I used too small a font. Well, I'll read it to you. It's G as a function of omega, and there's an index I. I goes between 1 and L. So L is the number of speakers, and G is the frequency-dependent gain of each of these speakers. So there are L speakers. In this case, I don't know, there are 16, I think. All right. So the next thing is we're going to talk about control points. The control points are these little dots in each circle. These are points where you can shoot for a certain pressure, or I should say it in a different way. These are the control points where you want to control the pressure. You want to achieve certain condition of pressure or acoustic pressure at these points to ensure the audio program that you want is heard here and the other one is heard there. So the control points, we are going to, they are specified by pressure. So we can talk about a pressure vector for zone A and zone B, also frequency dependent. And it goes from 1 to N sub A or N sub B, depending whether you are in zone A or zone B. N is the number of control points. So now we have capital L, number of speakers, and N sub A or N sub B is number of control points, these red dots that you see. So we're going to build up our formalism. Of course, when we talk about the control problem in acoustics, we're going to talk about a transfer function. And it's going to be essential to posing the problem. Here, we designate a transfer function by the capital H letter here. And this is so capital H has 2 subscript, I and L. Capital H describe the transfer function between a given speaker and a given control point. So I represents the control point, and L is the index that represents the speaker. So in other words, it's a one-to-one relationship between each of these 2 vectors, and you end up with a matrix. We call it capital H sub A, B to denote the 2 zones, and I goes between 1 and N, A or B, and L goes between 1 and L speakers. So this is a matrix. These are 2 vectors. Good. So by this definition, the transfer function is what maps the gain vectors into pressures. So you feed the speakers some signal, and you're in control of that. So that the G is what we want to solve for. In other words, the G is the big unknown. We want to know what signal to feed the speakers. So when those signals go through the transfer function, which describes the air and the interaction that the sound waves undergo from going from an external speaker to a external control point, to give you the pressure at these control points. So this is our plant model, so to speak. H is our transfer function, G is the input, and P is the output, which is pressure at these control points. Okay, so we can write P as vectors. This is a column vector made out of the P1 all the way to the last pressure of the last control point's pressure. So there are NAB elements in this vector. And G, again, is the complex gains. It goes from G to L. So this is pretty much the vocabulary I need you to remember to follow the rest of the talk. These are the important parameters that describe the problem. Now, I said that there are three methods. So I'm going to start with the first one, and that's the one that's historically earliest, and the one that is also simplest to understand. It says, first let me say something about the literature. This is probably too small fonts, but if you get the view graphs, you'll see these are the references of the three papers. If you want to have a crash course in this field and start contributing to it, you start with these three papers. The first one is the original paper where this method was first described. This comes from Korea. It's a group at the Korean Advanced Institute of Technology, Choi and Kim. And then in 2012, there was a PhD thesis and some work done also at both an ISPR and also in Samsung in Korea, and also at the same time at the same institute at KIST. Finally, a good paper to start with is probably this paper, reference 1, from which I took some of the graphics in the first few view graphs. And this paper attempts to derive a generalized formalism in which both the acoustic contrast acoustic contrast control method and the pressure matching method are both described. And it's a good paper to start with. Okay, so let's start with the acoustic control. The acoustic control method aims to create a bright spot and a dark spot, and hence the colors here, yellow and brown. And again, using the vocabulary we developed in the first slide, we can then define something called acoustic contrast. If this is not clear, I'll read it for you. Acoustic contrast is defined simply as the pressure, I'm sorry, as the energy, the ratio of the energy in the bright zone to the energy in the dark zone. That first sentence is a fancy, more accurate description. We're talking about the average acoustic potential energy density, but we're going to call it energy. And there is a small subscript there in the numerator. It's hard to see on these pixelated views. It's B, small b for bright. And the numerator is the energy density in the dark spot, D. And the ratio of the two energies gives you a measure of what's called acoustic contrast, where the goal of personal sound zones, at least in the context of the acoustic contrast control, is to increase that contrast, increase the ratio of the bright to dark. Now, that's not enough, because you can do so and blow your speakers or do severe distortion, and so you need to add some constraints on the loudspeaker effort. That's at least at least the first constraint you should put on. Of course, you can think of other constraints, but that will be the first one we should think of if you want to maintain integrity of your hardware. So the constraints of loudspeakers effort is quite often the number one constraint you think of. So that boils it down to a classical optimization problem, which can be expressed as follows. So you want to maximize the norm, this is the L2 norm of the pressure, okay, which is a measure of energy. So H times G, if you remember, will give you pressure. So this is the norm of it squared is a measure of the energy density. So you want to maximize this. In the bright zone, there's a B in the subscript of H. So this is the transfer function for the bright zone, for all the control points in the bright zone. Subject to a condition, this is what keeps your speakers from blowing. You want to make sure that the same quantity in the dark zone stays below a certain level. You don't want it to be zero, but zero means that you're going to ask your speaker or your hardware to do extreme effort. So you need to give it a low number enough so you can get a desired contrast and minimize the effort or the speaker effort. Okay? So this is why it's an optimization problem. On one hand, you want to increase the contrast, you want to increase this quantity. On the other hand, you want to decrease this a lot, except not too much, so it doesn't blow your speakers. So therefore, this is that inequality is called a constraint. So this is what's an optimization problem. Now, those of you who have taken course in optimization know that you can actually add more constraints. So I'm sorry, I misspoke. Okay, that constraint is not about the speaker. That constraint is about the pressure, and this is H times G. So that's not the speaker work. This is the actual same thing. This is the energy density in the dark zone, which we want to keep low. So you want that to be below a certain value. And then you want to make sure that the speaker themselves, the work they do, which is represented by this quantity, this is the gains, again squared, and again this is the L2 norm, gives you a measure of the work being done by the speakers. You want that to be below a certain value. So you have two constraints. The first constraint gives you the contrast, but not too much contrast. So it gives yourself a knob to let the contrast be enough, but not enough to blow your speakers. And this gives you a definition of what you mean by blowing your speakers. It has to be below a certain threshold, the work done by the speakers. Okay, so once you have posed such an optimization problem, then you can solve what's called a Lagrangian optimization by using the Lagrange multipliers. And any of you who've had a course in optimal theory knows what that's about. It's a mathematical method for finding an optimal solution that satisfies these constraints, which means gives you the high enough contrast, but respect a constraint on the speaker effort. And it turns out mathematically, for those of you who are mathematically minded, I'll just say what you do is to find the actual G. We are solving again for the gain vector G, the complex gain factor, that maximizes the Lagrangian, and this is the mathematical notation, which is made by summing and multiplying the terms of the constraints by lambda 1 and lambda 2. So first we have the first term, which is the HBG squared, the L2 norm. Second, you have the second constraint expressed by this second term here, and then multiplied by the first Lagrange multiplier is lambda 1, and then the last term is multiplied by the second Lagrange multiplier is lambda 2. The idea is that you want to choose the right lambda 1, lambda 2 that lead you to an optimal solution. That's what an optimization problem is. To find the solution, as those of you remember the optimization course, you just have to take a derivative of the Lagrangian with respect to the vector G and set it to 0. And if you do the math, you end up with this expression. This expression tells you that you have a matrix right here, which is made out of the product of the dark zone, the Hermitian of the dark zone transfer function multiplied by itself, which is a way how you take square of quantities of matrix quantities in the complex domain, plus the identity matrix. So multiplied by the vector G, and on the right side you have the same thing here, but for the bright zone, but without an identity matrix. So this equation here tells you something right away. Those of you who are mathematically minded will recognize this is an eigenvector problem, which is not trivial to solve. It's not In other words, we don't have a problem that can be solved analytically. We have to find solutions that are valid for some values of G. And these are called eigenvalues and eigenfunctions, of course. So this is an eigenvector problem. Now, the eigenvector problem can be solved, and the solution is basically finding the value of G, which we are going to call G star. That's the optimal solution. The ACC subscript there refers to the method itself, the acoustic contrast control. So the optimal value of G is the eigenvector corresponding to the maximum value of this matrix, which can be obtained directly from the equation above. So to solve this problem, you are actually doing an inversion. So this is called a pseudo inversion, and that beta, this is a little mistake here, beta should be lambda 2 over lambda 1, which appears in the first equation. That is called a regularization parameter. When that beta equal to 0, you are doing a perfect inversion. And that perfect inversion will give you extreme high contrast, but will blow your speakers. So it's the same thing when you invert something on your calculator and it's very close to 0, you get infinity. So you add a little epsilon to that quantity before you invert it in order to make it not blow your calculator. The same thing, same exact thing here. We add a little epsilon, we call it beta. It's called a regularization parameter that will allow us to do the inversion, now called pseudo inversion. So we don't blow our speakers, and we end up with a solution that maybe not as great as one in an ideal world where we have infinitely robust speakers, but one that we can implement in the lab and get enough contrast to do our personal zone without blowing the speakers. So when beta is large, we get low contrast, but the speakers are safe. When the beta is very small, we approach an inversion that's perfect inversion, and we call that a perfect filter or a perfect solution, but one that's not very practical. It can give us very high contrast by but high loudspeaker effort. All right, so this is the math behind this. Now the pressure matching method, before I go to the next method, so this method has been implemented. People solve that problem, and there are techniques for solving problem, an eigenvector optimization problem of this kind, numerically. And they have implemented, and I'm going to mention some results. So people tried to implement this method for both portable phones, computers, even TVs, in different environments. I'll mention later on when I compare the two methods what they found, but just the bottom line is they found that this method works fine for if you are in an environment that doesn't have too much noise and also doesn't have too much reflections. So if you are holding a mobile phone in the dark, I'm sorry, in a big room in front of you, far away from walls, you can use this method to derive the gains for the speakers, and there are only 3 speakers on these mobile phones, to give up to 10 dB acoustic contrast. So that if you are in front of that speaker, you can hear 10 dB louder in front of that mobile phone than somebody sitting next to you by using the equations on the previous slide. That sounds spectacular. However, as soon as you walk in next to a wall, things fall apart. So when people try to apply the ACC method inside a car cabin, the whole thing fell apart, and they get very little acoustic control. So starting around 2012, people thought of recasting the problem, the optimization problem, into something both more powerful and more general. And that's called the pressure matching method. Again, these are the references. I won't go through them here. They're mostly from down under, from New Zealand and Australia, where people first work on this method. There, the idea is, what happened to my plot here? Here we go. Okay. All right. So the aim is to, instead of trying to just increase the contrast itself, you do something else. You try to produce a desired sound field pressure. In other words, you have a pressure in mind that you want to exist there, and you want to shoot for it. We call that target pressure vector P. So you want these red dots to have a certain desired pressure that will build the sound field that you have in mind. And you want that to be in the bright zone. And you want silence in the dark zone. You want, and that's reminiscent of crosstalk cancellation. Crosstalk cancellation is a problem that we've worked on in the past, and as Lawrence mentioned, I've talked about it in here at DigiPen. Is similar in the sense that you are actually trying to match, and this is crosstalk cancellation, by the way, is used for getting binaural audio reproduced from speakers to people, to a listener, to a single listener. And there, the idea is to produce a certain desired pressure at the left ear, for example, of the listener. So the input to both left and right speaker is such that a certain desired pressure called target pressure is reached there, and silence, or in other words, that signal or that pressure is then negated or canceled at the other ear. So this is similar. Again, you are matching pressure as opposed to just optimizing a contrast ratio. So if now we agree that, you know, what the method is about, we can use the same vocabulary as before and write down an optimization problem. And again, these slides where there are a lot of equations are intended for the people of you among you who are theoretically or mathematically minded, but I've tried to summarize them in plain English to tell you the punchline. So again, going into the math, this is, now we are minimizing the difference between HBG, which is a pressure in the bright zone, minus P. And this is, and when we take the L2 norm, that becomes the least square mean. So this is basically an optimization. When taking the minimum, we are doing a least square optimization technique or minimization technique. So again, we're going to subject it to the same conditions, namely that the L2 norm of the pressure in the dark zone stays below a certain level. Then we want D0 to be low enough so we have good contrast, but we want, or rather good pressure matching in this case, and we want the speakers not to blow up. So we want the work done by the speakers, which is represented by G. Remember, G is the gain of the speaker. The L2 norm represents the work done. It has to be below a certain value, E naught. So you see, it looks very, very similar to the pressure, to the ACC, the Acoustic Contrast Control, except that it has this term minus P, the minus P hat rather, which is the desired pressure. We are trying now, however, now we're minimizing instead of maximizing. We're trying to minimize this quantity. In other words, we're trying to minimize the error between the desired pressure and the actual pressure at these red dots, the control points. That simple difference of searching for a minimum and having a minus, another term minus P, completely changes the cost function and the optimization. So if you follow the same steps as we followed before to minimize the Lagrangian cost function, you end up with an equation that looks similar to before, except that we have here a minus P and we're looking for a minimum. Again, we take this derivative with respect to G, set it equal to 0, and solve. And we get an equation that is quite different than before. We see G appearing only on one side as opposed to two sides, which tells us that G can be solved for analytically, as opposed to ended up with a generalized vector problem, eigenvector problem. So this is not an eigenvector problem. This is the analytically solvable problem, nicely enough, that we can solve. So here is the solution. That is the G star, the optimal value of the signal of the gains you have to feed the speakers, such that you get as good of a matching as possible, given the constraints, between the desired pressure and the realized pressure in these zones. So this technique has some advantages. The first one is it can be solved easier because it's analytically posed and can be solved using an interior point method, which is called a barrier method for those of you who deal with these calculations. It's a much more significantly much more easily handleable by algorithm and calculations. You can either make it even simpler by setting one of the Lagrange multipliers equal to 1, which will give you the particular case, which is quite useful and insightful, where the effort for matching the pressure in the bright zone is equal to the effort in minimizing the energy in the D zone. This is a particular case, not only of academic interest, but also potentially of particular interest, but that it even renders the problem even easier to solve. Okay, so what's the big deal about phase matching? Does it really do better than the other method? Well, first, from a formal point of view, you can show that it's more general than the previous method, meaning that it subsumes the previous method. How do we show that? It's very simple. If you choose, if the choice of p hat in the bright zone happens to be an ACC solution, in other words, a solution of the audio contrast control method, which would be p hat equal that solution multiplied by the bright zone transfer function, then the ACC and the PM method will have the same solution. That proves that the phase matching method is more general than and therefore subsumes the previous method. So we haven't lost any generality if we forget about ACC and move on to phase matching technique for designing personal sound zone. And that's one of the main advances that happened over the past 5 years. So aside from it being more general, it has some other implications. One of them I already said. It requires solving while the previous method requires solving an eigenvector problem, the pressure matching method gives an explicit solution for G star, which I already mentioned as a main advantage. Another advantage that's I'm not going to spend too much describing, except stating only that the pressure matching method is more suitable for adding more constraints. I mentioned earlier on that the speaker effort is an important constraint, but there are other constraints you have to worry about. For example, what about coloration to the sound? So the sound, if they get very high contrast and your speakers are fine, but you get very horrible sound in terms of tonal distortion, then you have not achieved a practical problem, or you have not solved a practical problem. So in order to keep a handle on coloration, you can add coloration as another constraint. And it's easier to do that with the pressure matching method than the acoustic control method. Another advantage is that, which is turned out to be very important, is that instead of just guaranteeing that you're going to get louder in one zone than the other, the pressure matching method is guaranteeing you're going to get a certain complex pressure, including the phase. That means you're going to get a better spatial reconstruction of the sound field, whether in 2D or 3D, depending how many speakers and how you're laying the speakers out. So in other words, it's much more robust in its reproduction of a 3D sound field or a 2D sound field even. Okay, let me give you an illustration of PM versus ACC. So this is a numerical simulation, which actually there have been experiments built very much like it. What you have here is a plane wave traveling at some frequency, going through the space. This is X versus Y, and it's coming from the upper right-hand corner. And you see that red circle. Inside that red circle, you can see those parallel wavefronts of the plane wave. So this is what you desire. In other words, you desire to reproduce that plane wave, and indeed, by doing the applying the pressure matching method, you get, this is the bright zone, you get what's desired. You are matched the desired pressure, and you see within that red circle, you see the parallel wavefronts of a typical plane wave propagating from about 2 o'clock on the right-hand side there down, and that is desired. On the black, okay, let me turn off my phone. Sorry about that. On the blue circle, what you see is gray, which represents attenuation, silence. Not exact silence, but a big attenuation. The ratio of the pressure here average over the red circle over the right, or the blue circle gives you the acoustic contrast. So this is done with the pressure matching method. Let's see what happens now when we do it. Let's compare it to the result of acoustic control. So this is a three-dimensional plot, which I need to explain. It has X, Y, and Z axis. On the Z axis, which is the height, is the acoustic control. The higher that is, the higher the ratio between the two loudness, so to speak, and the louder it is, and the more the contrast is, so to speak. So on the X-axis, MSE in bright zone, that stands for the mean square error, which is how badly we have matched the desired pressure. The lower that number is negative numbers, the lower the error, and the better the matching. On the Y-axis, it says array effort. That's how hard your speakers are working. So as you go above 0 dB, your speakers are doing quite a bit of work, and you want to limit it. So in this particular case, both problems, PM and ACC, were limited to a couple dB or so, about 10 dB or so work on the speaker. So in other words, both of them are not allowed to go beyond a certain point above 20 dB on the right axis. So let's look at the blue curve first. The blue curve, which is the ACC method, it can achieve it goes up very high. It can achieve very high contrast. 80 dB, 70 dB according to the simulation. However, you will see that the pressure matching is lousy. So in other words, it's the mean square error in matching the desired pressure stays close to 0, as opposed to minus 35 dB for the case of pressure matching. So even though pressure matching curve, the red curve, doesn't go up very high, it goes up enough, 20 dB, to give you significant isolation or contrast, but more importantly, reconstruct spatially, because it's matching the pressure, the complex pressure, therefore is giving you a more spatial reproduction, a higher fidelity in the spatial reproduction, in the phase reproduction. When people reproduce this experimentally, what they heard with the pressure matching is a plane wave passing by you, while what they heard in the ACC is a whooshing sound going around you. All right, so we see the advantages. Now, a few words about implementation. The implementation, you have to know where to put the speaker. You ask yourself where to put the speakers, how many speakers, how to lay them out, and what configuration. It turns out the pressure matching technique can tell you a lot about this. It can tell you that from dimensional analysis, I don't know if you can see this, but I'll read it to you. There's a formula that has in it the number of zones. This is generalized for many zones, and the maximum frequency, or the wave number, that you want to attain, because the higher the number of speakers, the more limited you are. I'm sorry, the less limited you are in your production of higher frequencies. This is called spatial aliasing. So for a given frequency, maximum frequency, you get a certain number of speakers. If you want to go to higher frequencies, you need a higher number of speakers. So just from the dimensional analysis of the pressure matching method, you can come up with a formula for the minimum number of speakers for that is a function of the radius of the zone, the frequency, and the number of the zones. The more zones you have, you multiply it by the number of zones. So it goes linearly with the number of zones. Now, for 3D reproduction is a similar formula, but there's a square. So in other words, what's nice about it is you can derive these requirements for building an actual system, which people have. Another thing is that there is another way to approach the problem than I did in this talk. Instead of using frequency analysis, you can do what's called wave domain analysis or mode domain analysis, and allows you to get very interesting insight that's complementary to the frequency analysis. So wave domain analysis allows you to get a lot of interesting and a lot of useful rules on how to lay out the speakers, optimal loudspeakers, and the control point positions that you need to choose. So that, in other words, I'm telling you, the pressure matching method lends itself even to rules on how to lay the speakers through the wave domain analysis. Now, I mentioned the results. So I mentioned that the ACC method was able, with only 3 loudspeakers on a mobile device, back in 2010, got about 10 dB acoustic contrast or performance acoustic contrast between the bright zone in front of the mobile phone and immediately next to it, about 10 dB less. When people went to do the same thing on a laptop, they were able to get significant contrast, 19 dB, but only in an anechoic environment. As soon as they went out from the anechoic chamber, things got bad. Things got really worse when you do it in an environment that really matters, which is the car cabin. So imagine the application in a car cabin. So imagine you are with someone, you're on a long trip, you want to listen to different music. You want ideally the contrast to be about 15, if not 20 dB between the 2 spots. So, especially if you want silence. If you want to create one zone that's a silent zone, you want at least 20 dB to relax. And ACC falls apart. However, the pressure matching zone shows quite a bit of robustness in these environments. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this, but there's a way of combining both that has been discussed in the literature back in 2012. That's a paper on combining both method, and it shows some advantages that you end up requiring less speakers. I'm not going to mention that. I'm not going into detail because I have only a few minutes left, and I'm going to get to the modern method. So the modern method is a method that we developed over the past 3 years in my lab. So the formalism is formulated in such a way that it subsumes, as I will show you, both the pressure matching and the acoustic control method. MODER stands for multi-listener audio with high isolation delivery, but the bottom line is just another name for another method. But what's special about this method, it is more general and hence can be more powerful. So the generalized, instead of, we have to think of, to describe the method, the best way is to think of it not in terms of creating dark and bright zones, but something more general in terms of creating 2 different programs or 2 different sets of programs in each zone, or a different set of programs in each zone. As a particular case of that, one of the programs could be silence, in which case you can have a similar case that the one which we looked at before with pressure matching and ACC. But more generally, we speak about this situation, where we have now, instead of talking about bright and dark, we talk about 2 zones. Both of them are bright. We want to deliver a program U sub A to zone A and program U sub B to B. By program, it could be many things. It could be, for example, I want people in zone A to hear 2 speakers, like stereo, sitting in 2 positions in space. And I want people in person in zone B or the people there to hear a surround sound system. So by UA and UB will be the programs that you in each channel of these stereo or surround sound system. So instead of talking about pressure, I'm going to talk about programs. And that's the essence of the modern method. And you'll see it by shifting attention away from pressure and trying to focus on recast the problem in terms of pressure. In terms of programs, you'll end up with a generalization that's very useful. Okay, so I'm going to construct a vector U made out of elements from 1 to P, where P is the number of programs. For example, surround sound 5.1, 5 speakers, and stereo 7 speakers. So you will have 7 elements. And I'm going to split them into subvectors. One sub U sub A for zone A. That's a vector in the complex plane that has PA elements. P is the number of programs, or if you will, in that part of the vector, and UB there. Now is the big important step, is I'm going to specify a target matrix. Instead of a target pressure, I'll talk about target matrix. So the target matrix relates these programs to the pressure. The pressure subhat is the same pressure subhat that we used in the pressure matching problem, except now the focus is on this T. And you will see in a minute that this allows me to decouple the problem. So I end up with a problem that gives me a basis for many solutions that I can use for many problems after a single solution. So let's keep going. What is T? So T is a matrix that has two parts. It contains two submatrices, TA and TB for each of the two zones, which are have as many columns as there are number of control points and as many rows as there are number of programs. And the rest are zeros. This sounds very abstract. Let me give you an actual example. Let's say I want to deliver binaural audio through crosstalk cancelled by binaural audio to two people. So this is kind of a subcase that's clearer to describe. So I have two people right here. Each has, so I only have two red dots, two control points for each person. So the vector U has only 4 elements. The program for vector for zone A, for the person in zone A, is nothing but the program for the left speaker or left channel, U sub AL, and the right channel, U sub AR. The same thing for the speaker in zone B. He gets or she gets a left program for her left ear and one for the right ear. And I want these to be crosstalk canceled. So whatever comes to the left ear doesn't go, or it's canceled at the right ear. This way I can deliver 3D spatial audio. And those of you who experience a very good crosstalk cancellation of binaural signal can understand why this can be exciting. So in that particular case, I will cook T to be a diagonal matrix unity, 1. That means that if you multiply, you can see if you multiply it by this vector of programs, I will get pressures. The left ear and the right ear will get only program. The left ear will only get the program intended only for the left ear, and multiplying that vector by the matrix, the right ear of listener A will get only the program intended for his left ear, and the lady in the B program will get only exactly the left ear program to a left ear, and so on for the right ear. So they get each crosstalk cancellation and each their own programs. This is only one way of concocting things. I could change that matrix the way I want. I can also change the inputs. What's nice about this is that now I can go ahead and recast the problem the same way I cast the problem of oppressive matching in terms of optimization and the Lagrangian. But in here, I'm going to write my cost function, which is the objective function, as a difference between pressure like before. I need to re-enter the space. I see. Okay. Let me see that. Can you hear me now?
Hi, Edgar.
Hi, Lawrence. Sorry, I don't know what happened. Am I back? Can people hear me?
You are back. Make sure you're on air and you have amplify my voice
Yes.
set. And then we should probably wrap
Okay.
it up because we're getting near
Yep.
the end.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah. Sorry. All right.
No,
So
no
let
worries,
me.
no worries.
Yeah. Let me wrap it up. So and get to the punchline here. So, I need to go back to my slides, which are right here and right here. There we go. Slides. Well, the slides come up here. The bottom line is that this method can be cast into a more general method. And you can even prove two theorems that show you that this method assumes all previous methods and is more general. So what can we do with it? So when my slides come up here, I'll show you what we can do with what we've done with it in the lab. Okay. So now let's go to the punchline and show you. Well, I'm not going to go through this math except to tell you that you can now apply it in the lab because it allows you to calculate what's called a Malor filter matrix that's universal for a set of for a given general problem, and then change the programs without having to change the filter. This is what happens in this diagram, which I don't have the time right now to go into detail, except to tell you that if you use the pressure matching, you'll have to recalculate the filter for every time you change the program. So, well, how does it do in the lab? This is a setup that we have to study the model system. And as you see, there are a bunch of speakers right there, regular General X speakers, and then a bunch of smaller speakers. These smaller speakers work in concert as a phase array to produce beams of sound. And we combine both beamforming and regular speakers and apply model filter to them. We can also take an array of microphones and map that space to show what actually the filter does, the model filter does. So here is a picture of the pressure. These, let's look at the first one at 300 hertz. And you can see those two little white dots is where the driver, so to speak, the guy on the left is, and the two red dots is the person sitting in the dark zone. And you see there's a huge contrast. There's about 20 dB difference between the two. So the mono filter can achieve very high contrast at high frequency. Look what happens at low frequency. When you go to high frequency, things become, all the side lobes start to set in, and you start getting less areas where you can still get high contrast, but if you move slightly, you might lose that contrast. And this is why we end up using beamforming at higher frequencies. So this is a typical result with a mono filter. By combining beamforming class 2 and class 1 filters, we can cover a range between few tens of hertz all the way to 20 kilohertz and achieve contrast levels or isolation levels or performance metrics well above 15 dB needed for delivering programs. The big question is head robustness, which, as I showed you from the previous plot, can affect how easily you can sit in that space and move and still get the contrast you requires. And for that, we're using all kinds of techniques, including more filtering and head tracking, so we can adjust the filters in real time to achieve increased robustness against head movements. Other problems, of course, are robustness against reflections. But I want to point out that those measurements were done in a real room, not in an anechoic chamber, where reflections and reverberant fields are present. And still, unlike the acoustic contrast control method, modern promises more robustness to room reverberation. So I would like to conclude here and ask you if you have any questions for me. Admittedly, this is more a formalism talk, giving an overview, not about the actual practicalities, but I'll be happy to question both questions right now also about practicalities. Thank you.
Alright, so I'm going to reiterate for anyone new. If you would like to ask a question, go ahead and press the raise hand button in the lower right of your screen. Hopefully you guys can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Megan.
Okay. Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay.
I cannot hear anyone. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Great. My question was just about use cases. I was trying to just imagine some different scenarios where this would come in handy, and you mentioned the car interior and being able to isolate small teeny zones even within that tight environment. Am I imagining that correctly? Is that what's it's kind of the intent with this, and then maybe what
Yes,
are some other zones or other use cases?
The car cabin is a very, very hot topic. In this field, we call the car New York City. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. So because reflections are so dominant in reverberation and closed space, and the acoustic pressure builds up on windshields and so on. This is a very difficult problem. This is why ACC method failed, and so accomplish it in the car cabin will be the ultimate achievement. But in terms of use cases, there you can imagine, as I said, where somebody can get their GPS information, the driver, without having to disturb the passenger who's listening to their own music. Some people say, well, you're creating bubbles and isolating people. I like to think that this also could save marriages on long trips and vacations where people can listen to their own programs and not fight over them. But you hit on it. The car cabin is probably one of the most important applications where in offices you want to create a quiet space. Or in a museum, you want to create different programs in front of different exhibits. You can also imagine applications in a classroom or in a teaching environment, and on and on. So, but you definitely put your finger on one of probably the hottest and what's driving a lot of the research and funding in this field, which is the car cabin.
I see. Okay.
A little bit easier environment is the airplane cabin from a point of view of space, but not from point of view of background noise. But in first class cabin and business cabin, some noise. I mean, in the airplanes where you have both the spaciousness and low noise, you can achieve better results than in car cabin in principle. Although this is still being looked at.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Now again, the big question is that you can do the whole thing with headphones, of course, but the idea is the whole challenge of this field is that you don't require people to wear headphones, so people can walk in and out of a personal zone without having to worry about wearing headphones or worry about having their own hardware.
Oh, you might have to re-megaphone, Edgar. I don't know why alt space is being weird.
Oh, I see. Okay, let me see. It's right. Oh yes. Did my voice fade out right now or before?
No, you're good now. But we heard
I'm fine now.
too. You're fine.
Okay.
Andrew, feel free to ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Great talk. I just have a question about productizing this. Does the size and quality of the speaker array required for this effect make this essentially an enterprise location-based or premium car cabin product only, or do you see this becoming a consumer technology with miniaturization of speakers or something like that?
Well, the approach and the methodology and the research is being done with almost no concern of the quality of the speakers, as long as they can deliver the required SPL from the required at the required distances. Of course, like anything else, for an actual product and certain desired quality, you will have different requirements for speakers. But in general, the problem itself is quite independent of speakers. A lot of the speakers, for example, in this, well, I don't have my viewcast anymore in front of me, but in the lab, the Genelec speakers are very good speakers, but in the array, in the phase array where we have 50, 60 speakers, well, we have 32 plus 16 speakers, 48. These speakers are like $1 each, okay? So there's nothing special about them. Of course, they're fine if you don't try to reach very high SPL from a distance, but this is a laboratory setup. But as a product, yes, if you're in the speaker business, this is a great field because you get to sell a lot of speakers, because a lot of these control problems require multiple speakers, of course. But one of the drivers for optimization is to minimize the number of speakers. And I mentioned earlier, for example, combining the acoustic control method and the pressure matching method actually allows you to go beyond the spatial Nyquist frequency, which means that you can get to the same frequency with less speakers. So people want to minimize the number of speakers because of practicality and the physical limits of where to put them. And remember, if you want to have a 3D audio, you will have to a 3D elevation and so on. You need to even have speakers with height to reproduce that part, which means that you need 3D layouts. But for many applications, 2D layout is enough.
Perfect. Thank you. I look forward to this technology when it iterates into 20th century composers like John Cage.
Great.
We've moved from Bach to Mahler already so far.
Great. Yeah, I hope the next AVAR we were, if it wasn't for COVID, we would have brought this setup with us that would give a demo of sitting in 2 seats and standing up and shifting the seats between passenger and driver so you can hear different programs. We can achieve about 14 dB without moving your head too much, without head tracking. 14 dB in a regular room with the combination of phase array and regular speakers and a motor filter. But a lot of other groups around the world are working on this problem, so I think progress will happen quickly. But as you saw, this is a very rich problem, and spending time early on developing a powerful casting the optimization problem correctly and generally pays a price. So unfortunately, you were subjected to this exercise today. I'm hoping that in future conferences, it will be more fun showing you the actual results of this formalism as opposed to the math. And the results are already in the lab, but we'll bring them out. Well, I see a hand in the back. The lady in the yellow shirt.
Oh, I might have accidentally raised my own hand somehow. I don't know. But
Okay.
Jeff, you can go ahead and ask another question.
I actually didn't have one. I don't know how this happened, but
Weird. Allspace is having another
if
hiccup.
I hit the wrong.
That's okay. Hiccups are us.
Here, there we go. Does anyone else have any questions? David, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. So I didn't understand a lot of the technical details, but is my understanding correct? You don't need to recompute the filter if somebody moves their head, but it's the same filter.
No, I was referring to something else, but the Mahler method, you don't have to recompute the filter if you decide to deliver different program. For example, let's say you want the passenger to go to sleep, and you want to have silence in the passenger seat, and you want the person driving to keep getting her GPS information. Now, with the pressure matching, you will have to recalculate a filter that gives you silence there. With the minor method, you don't have to do that. Oh, microphone went off again. Thank you, Megan. Okay, the megaphone is back. So with the, I was saying with the minor method, you don't have to recalculate the filter. The filter is already there. You just have to apply different inputs, so to speak, program to it. That's the main advantage. However, I should say that calculating the filter is 4 times more expensive for the case of 4x4 than calculating 4 pressure matching filters. So the calculation of the mono filter itself is more expensive, but it lends itself to more immediate changes in the program, so it's more practical. I should also say this is all early. I mean, this field really is quickly growing. A few years ago, 3 years ago, I didn't have much to say about it. Now we have PhD thesis in the making about it, so things are evolving very quickly. So it could very well be that what I just described, it could evolve in different ways. But right now, you know, that's the state of the art, so to speak. And this is supposed to be a review of the state of the art.
Great, thanks.
By the way, head tracking causes another complication. On one hand, head tracking can increase robustness because you will have to calculate either beforehand a series of filters and store them, and then call them as a function of your head location for head tracking to work. But at the same time, it complicates things because you have 2 people moving their head. So the entire matrix, filter matrix is changing. So then you need a lot of RAM to store all this possible combination of model filters. Either that, or think even of something we haven't thought about yet, Model Plus or Beethoven, that where we have even general formalism that allows these problems to be formulated more generally to implement head tracking in a more natural way. Right now, head tracking is being implemented in a way that's like we did for crosstalk cancellation that requires that you calculate multiple filters. And we only just started to apply. We looked into head tracking a year and a half ago, and we're going to get back to it in the next month or so. But head tracking is very important because at high frequencies, as you saw from the plots I showed you, the zone where you have silence, or basically where you achieve the contrast, is filamentary because of the existence of side lobes. And there, instead of just using regular speakers, it looks like it's preferable to use beams that you can steer. So instead of doing mono filtering, then you can steer the beams with you, especially if you're only concerned about the control points being ears. So you have two applications. One we have concentrated on, where we only care about where the ears of the listeners are. And so far, we've applied mono only to that situation. But a lot of other colleagues around the world are looking for a zone where you are actually creating a zone where anybody who comes in that zone will hear a certain program. Both approaches have benefits and challenges that are quite different. The advantage of solving the problem that we are working on, where we're only concerned about the ears, is that you really can do wonderful matching with head tracking, because then you can steer beams with phase arrays to follow the person's sound, so the sound zone kind of moves with you. But that requires nifty formulation of the mono filter, or at least a pre-calculation of many mono filters that are then stored in RAM and then used in real time as a function of the head location that's being tracked with the head tracking system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for clarifying.
Thank you. Is he almost coming?
Right. I think we are going to wrap up this Q&A.
Thank you very
However,
much.
however, if I may say, Edgar, I don't know what your time is like and everybody else, but we do have open chat in the AVAR lobby now until 5 or later if you want. So anybody, hopefully, Edgar, you can join us there if anybody has more questions for Dr. Choueiri. join us in AVAR lobby, and perhaps he'll be able to tell you more of the shiny new future that he's always cooking up. Dr. Choueiri, thank you so much. A fabulous talk.
Thank you.
Really great.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. I definitely will be there. And
all
it's sad
right.
to see the cafeteria empty, but
yeah, I
will
know
definitely
the coffee leaves something to be desired, but then again, it always did.
So the DigiPen cafeteria is very famous, so I thought I should mention it.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that when we get over there. See you all over in the AVAR lobby, and then tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for plenary session 2. Thanks, everybody.